Let's turn our Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 4, if you would. 2 Kings chapter 4. Many of us have prayed for Sarah's mother. She lost her stepfather a while back, but her mother's going through a number of issues, from problems, physical and otherwise. And Friday, Sarah texted me and let me know that her mother had passed. I got to visit with her mother on a number of occasions. I really enjoyed my time with her, but she had a troubled life. They were just arranging hospice care and had barely got things settled in that regard, and she went to be with the Lord. So keep Sarah and her family, the extended family, in your prayers, if you would, as they mitigate all the things that will be forthcoming. I also got my uncle reached out to me. Some of you remember years ago when he lived in San Jose, I used to meet him in, I guess it's Los Banos? I used to drive, he used to drive from San Jose, I would drive from here. We'd meet in Los Banos every month or every other month. Really enjoyed my time with him. He was my natural father's brother. He was instrumental in putting me in contact with my dad after we had not seen each other or heard from each other in probably 15 years or so. And of course, my father passed away, succumbed to cancer. And I kept that relationship with my uncle going. Really enjoyed my time with him. While I was attending college up in San Jose, his wife was coaching a softball team, and I kind of was an assistant coach, and he would invite me over. And I really loved my Uncle Glenn. He was a Christian, but not as outspoken about his faith. And he just started getting involved. He was attending a Baptist church up there in the Bay Area. Went on missions trips, among other places, to the Philippines, and was really growing in his walk with the Lord. So it gave us a lot of things to talk about as we met together. Unfortunately, they relocated to Mesa, Arizona, and my aunt began to undergo some medical problems. She, first of all, had a stroke, a rather serious stroke, and then she was in recent years struggling with some form of dementia. If you talk to her on a superficial level, she seemed like her old self, but there were some things that were happening that my uncle was very keenly aware of course. I just heard from him that she suffered another massive stroke, her second one, and she was in the emergency room. Her name is Maureen, M-A-U-R-E-E-N, Maureen Miller. If you keep her in your prayers, we'd appreciate that. I'm not altogether sure how that's going to play out. My brother Robert and I are contemplating actually a surprise visit on my uncle and aunt before we knew that she was going to have this stroke. And I was trying to carve out some time, maybe during spring break or something, where I could get away and see them. I'd been some years since I've seen them. And my brother was going to bring his my other brother, and we were all going to meet together and kind of surprise my uncle and aunt. I don't know how this will play out now, but just keep her in your prayers for her health needs. I would really appreciate that. To really appreciate the miracles that are taking place here under the life of this remarkable man Elisha, and even before him under the man Elijah. Before we get into our text, we need to remember something about the day and age in which they ministered. First of all, the nation under Solomon's son Rehoboam had been divided. It had been split in two. Most of you know the history of the nation involved the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And there were originally 12 tribes of Israel throughout the Old Testament period. And some of you know the northern kingdom had, how many tribes are located in the north? A little quiz here. 10 tribes to the north. That would leave 2 to the south. And the southern region had its own problems, but if I could make a general statement, the more noteworthy or godly or God-fearing kings were in the southern kingdom, although there were some bad eggs there too. But the northern kingdoms were predominantly men who failed the nation miserably, turned their backs upon God, and because of that, they brought upon tremendous judgment and hardship to the northern region. And this played out in many different ways. It played out in internal problems. They had division. They had a lot of wars with their enemies. If you know the history, you'll know that there's a reference to the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They were not so much lost in the sense that somebody got up one day and said, what happened to them? They're all gone. They got lost. They assimilated. They intermarried with the pagan nations around them. They lost their identity. They forsook their religion and their faith in God, and they just sort of assimilated, and their identity as distinct tribes of Israel was over a long period of time pretty much dissipated. So you have to understand that Elisha and Elijah before him, they're serving in that northern region. That's their area of ministry. It would be like going to a really dark part of the world today where the Bible is hardly known or translated into the language of the people. They are steeped in idolatry and paganism, and there's some parts of the world like that today, and I really admire missionaries who go and take those regions and go in and try to do a work for God. It's painstaking. It's a slow process. There are a lot of dangers involved in that. And so Elisha, in this particular setting here, was serving in this kind of a climate. And because the people refused to listen to God's word and heed the warnings against idolatry, it was bringing tremendous hardship upon the entire nation. And that was played out in different ways. In the book of Deuteronomy, God said very clearly that he will bless the nation who honors him and obeys him. But on the other hand, on the flip side of that coin, he will bring cursings and judgment upon his people if they forsake him and turn their back upon him. And specifically, those warnings say if they go after other gods. Well, you know what? The leadership of the nation in the northern kingdom and the people at large were going after other gods. They were accepting these forms of idolatry. So you might think it a tremendous privilege when God said in his word over and over to them, you know what, I pick you. You didn't pick me. I pick you. You're to be my distinct people. You are a special people. I'm making a covenant with you. I'm singling you out of all the nations and peoples of the earth alive. I'm going to single you out to call you my people, and I will be your God. Now, you can probably see I'm hinting about the condition of America today, because there are many people today who believe that God has shed his grace on thee, and that he's given us a tremendous heritage as Americans and as a people. If we're not careful, we might be like the people of Elisha's day that think that we are somehow entitled to this, because this is a Christian nation. We have a godly heritage, and God just smiled upon this nation and blessed and continues to bless this nation in many ways. We're not a third world country. We still are held in high regard around the world. But you have to ask yourself, and they should have asked themselves, why did God choose us? Why did God choose us? Why did God choose America to favor us with all of these natural resources and this wonderful heritage? I could take a whole series of classes and talk about all the inventors and inventions and pioneers and trendsetters that have come from our nation and brought us to the point that we are today with all of the resources available to us. It may surprise you to know that God did not choose Israel. Because here's this, from an international point of view, a rather obscure nation in the Middle East, far away from us, and he still is doing very unusual things through this nation of Israel. Maybe you've contemplated that and thought, wonder why he chose Israel. Why did he choose that specific country? Some people believe that his covenant plan for Israel has now fallen by the wayside, and they take a more open approach to things that are happening, around the whole worldview. This has created, actually, some anti-Semitism. There's some nations that are jealous of or angry or bitter at Israel because God established them as his special covenant people. Not a group of nations around there. No, only one nation of all the nations in the world. God says, you are my special covenant people. And when God does something like that to somebody, it creates some division, animosity. And we see that being played out today, certainly in the Middle East and even from a broader view. So you want to ask yourself, why would God choose Israel? And there may have been a propensity for them to think that, well, he chose Israel because we're special. We're special in his eyes. We are the apple of his eye. There's something about us that causes us to be worthy. And he's going to drive out all these nations and give them tremendous victory because there's something great about us. God must have looked at us somehow and said, what a wonderful people. Maybe Americans believe we're entitled to something like that from God as well, that he's favored us and we're special in his eye. And there's an interesting passage. If you want to turn there, you can. I'll read it to you. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 9, and it factors in a lot. And we'll get into our text in a minute. It factors a lot into what is happening in this period of history for the nation of Israel. And it answers the question, why did God choose Israel as his covenant people, as his special people? Why did he choose of all the people to say, you, Israel, the Hebrews, are my children? And I've got a special plan in history for you as a nation. In Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse number 3, we read these words. Understand therefore this day that the Lord thy God is he which goeth over before thee. Now, it's speaking about the conquest which was to come. Remember crossing the Jordan River and going into all the land of Canaan, overthrowing all these nations? The Lord thy God is he which goeth over before thee. As a consuming fire he shall destroy them, and he shall bring them down before thy face. So shalt thou drive them out and destroy them quickly, as the Lord hath said unto thee. Did that happen as he said it would? Absolutely. But now we get the why. Look at verse 4. Speak not thou in thine heart, after that the Lord thy God hath cast them out from before thee, saying, For my righteousness the Lord hath brought me in to possess this land. But, he says, for the wickedness of these nations the Lord doth drive them out from before thee. Not for thy righteousness, in case you missed it the first time, not for thy righteousness or for the uprightness of thine heart dost thou go to possess their land, but for the wickedness of these nations the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee, and that he may perform the word which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In case they missed it the second time, look at verse number 6. Understand, therefore, that the Lord thy God giveth thee not this good land to possess it for thy righteousness, for thou art a stiff-necked people. That's interesting. I'm going to give this to you. Every place your soul shall tread shall be yours. You shall get it. I'm going to go before you. I'm going to drive out the enemies. He said in this passage, like a consuming fire. I'm going to give you that land. It shall be yours for your inheritance. Wait a minute. But don't think it's because of your righteousness, because you're good, that you're somewhat deserving of it. It's as if he says, in spite of you, I'm going to do this because I also have a plan for those other heathen nations around you, which were involved in idolatry. They rejected me. They have turned their backs upon me. They will not listen to my word. They do not acknowledge me. They're going after these false gods. So don't you think it ironic that here we are these many years later under Elisha, and the nations around them are still involved in this pagan idolatry, worshiping objects and false gods and creating gods with their hands. And God's covenant people are doing everything the nations around them are doing. You want to shake your head. And so God had had enough. God is going to make a statement through his people. And even though the great majority of them had turned their backs upon him, God raised up people like prophets to come and warn his people about the consequences of following these other gods. He says, not because I haven't done these things, and nor will I continue to do these things because you deserve it, because you're righteous, because you're upright in heart. In fact, in that last verse, he said, you are stiff-necked. You are stubborn people. You are a stubborn people. But in spite of that, I'm going to drive out those enemies. I'm going to make a statement to the nations around you. If Israel would have fulfilled their purpose, the other nations could have seen God reveal the falsehood and the futility of this false religion. If God's people would have done their part, He would have blessed them, driven out the enemies, and they would have said, they would have wised up and said, well, there is a God, and it's not our statues and stone images. There is a God. He's in control. Look what he's done to that people. And that's not without precedent, by the way. Even a wicked king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar saw the miracles that God performed under his people, and he said, that Lord, he is God. There's something to be said for his God. Look what that miracle-working God has done for him. Let's turn to that God. And it's never too late for a nation. I've always believed in the possibility of revival and God's people as a nation here in America praying and humbling themselves and seeing a revival sweep the land. It's never too late for America, but it's really time for we as a people, Christian people, to stand up and say, let's draw the line right now and say this is where we stand. And if God's going to bring our nation back to himself, it's going to begin not with the leaders of the country, not with the false religions of the country. There's a lot of religions in America. It's going to begin with God's people, his Christians. So the miracles that we read about in Elisha's ministry here occurred during a time of famine. It's kind of interesting that many of the judgments that God brought upon the nation centered around their ability to feed themselves. And this factors into play because if you know anything about the idolatry of that day, the predominant religion of the day, if I could give it a title, it wasn't given a title, but if I could give it a title, it was called Baal worship. Now, interestingly, among other things, Baal was the god of rain and lightning and thunder. We've all enjoyed the rain we've had in recent weeks. I hope you've enjoyed the rain you've had in recent weeks because there's probably more coming this week. But in order to get to work or church, my wife and I drive east first, and then we come across west toward the church. And I get to see those beautiful foothills. The Kuas know what I'm talking about. You're a little closer than me. To look at the foothills and see all the snow-capped mountains over there. It's just beautiful. East of town with the sun coming out on a clear day with all those white-capped mountains. And if we were living during the time of Elisha, the people they'd be going around saying, Baal has favored us again. Baal has brought, wonderful rain and snow to the region. It's kind of funny. This period right now was a very difficult period. And they were calling out to their false gods to bring deliverance to the people. One reason that God used men like Elisha and Elijah before him was to show that he was in control. He just said, you're not going to follow me, you're not going to honor me. I'm just going to show you that I'm in control. The entire nation was far away from God. But there were some who remained faithful. I can't tell you exactly how many. We do know from his predecessor, Elijah, God once rebuked the prophet Elijah, who was Elisha's mentor, when he said, I'm all by myself. I'm the only one doing the right thing. And God reminded Elijah that there were how many who had not bowed their knee to Baal? Remember the number, David? Did you say it? Or was it Jim? Who said that? I thought I heard it. How many had not bowed the knee to Baal under Elijah's ministry? 7,000. Remember that? Anybody know that? I thought I heard somebody say it. 7,000. 7,000. Now, there could have been a little less. There could have been a little more. It could have been about the same amount under Elisha. It wasn't that much later. But there were thousands of people who would not bow their knee to Baal that remained faithful to God. And we refer to that 7,000 people in that context as the remnant. They're what was left of the nation that once honored God almost collectively as a nation. There's always some bad eggs. But, there were 7,000 that would refuse to bow their knee. And Elijah was reminded about that remnant of people that were faithful. And God was going to use this remnant to impact the nation during very dark times. The northern kingdom was, again, steeped in idolatry. And one of the things that Elijah did, whether it was his idea or not, I don't know, but he developed what we refer to as these schools of the prophets. When Elijah made his trip to eventually be taken up in a whirlwind, we find out that every time he came to a different city, a group of people from this particular local school of the prophets came out and they said to Elisha, hey, do you know your master's going to be taken from you today? And he said, shh, I know it. Don't say anything about it. And he said, I'm sticking with them. Don't distract me. I got to be there. I'm not going to receive that blessing. And there were these schools of the prophets that were raised up among the remnant to bring the message to the people at large. I have the highest regard for academic institutions that train people for service to God. Very difficult to do that. We have one here in our church ministry. Our Christian school has been around since, I want to say 2000, Lisa. We started in 2000. And boy, it's been a joy over the years to look at people who have gone on through the school and they've gone on to use their life to serve the Lord, whether they're in full-time ministry or not. The school has done a lot of good for people in their service to Jesus Christ. And it's come at a cost. It takes a lot of patience and a commitment on the part of our staff and our people to educate people. And many have gone on, and whether they've gone on for a 4-year degree or gone on for a while, these institutions have done a lot of good in helping to bring the message to a nation that desperately needs to hear that God is still on the throne and he's still in control. My pastor said to me, just go 1 year. As it turned out, I went 2.5 years. But he said, just go a year. He felt like a Bible college or academic institution that was saturated with the Word of God and biblical principles would do me a lot of good. And he was absolutely right. He was absolutely right. It had done me a lot of good. I didn't know at the time I'd be a pastor, but I'm very appreciative to institutions like that around the world. And some of our young people have taken advantage of those for their education, and some have gone for a while. Some have got their degrees, but they've done a lot of good. And these schools were in some ways the only bright hope, spiritual hope for the nation. And so, having said that, I've given you a background now. We're going to look at one of these schools located in the city of Gilgal. Okay, so we're in where should be in 2 Kings chapter 4. Let me read to you verses 38 to 41. It's a short text, but let's see what happens here. It's seemingly a little story in the middle of a tremendous passage and book of the Bible. In verse 38, Elisha came again to Gilgal, and there was a dearth in the land, and the sons of the prophets were sitting before him. And he said unto his servant, set on a great pot, and seethe pottage for the sons of the prophets. And one of the seminary students, if I can use that terminology, one of the Bible college students, went out into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine and gathered thereof wild gourds, his lapful. And he came and shred them into the pot of pottage, for they knew them not. In other words, he didn't know exactly what he was throwing into the stew there. So they poured out for the men to eat, and it came to pass, as they were eating of the pottage, that they cried out and said, O thou man of God, there is death in the pot, and they could not eat thereof. But he, Elisha, said, then bring meal. And he cast it into the pot, and he said, pour out for the people that they may eat, and there was no harm in the pot. Interesting story. A little blip on the screen of Elisha's life, and things are going. A day, we're talking about the life and times of Elisha. This is a day in the life of Elisha and some of his seminary students. And we're going to look at this and apply it to our country today. So if you're taking notes, I have 3 simple points. Number 1, I want you to write down the scarcity. The first point worth mentioning is the fact that Elisha made the effort to travel to Gilgal to check in on one of those schools of the prophets, when in fact he had a pretty good thing going in Shunem. He had a lady and her husband who were very gracious and hospitable and provided a place for him to stay. We do know that there was a dearth, a famine in the land. Probably as an itinerant preacher, he wondered where the next meal was going to come from anyway. But he could have selfishly said, I'm just going to hang around here. I got a nice situation. These people have financial resources. They're very hospitable. They set aside these provisions for me and my servant. We're just going to stay here. There'll always be plenty to eat here. There's a place of comfort. They set up this situation perfectly for me. I don't want to travel. I don't want to deal with all of the paganism that's going on. I don't want to address enemies. I don't want the fear of the dangers while traveling on the road. I don't want the responsibilities of running these little seminaries. I'm going to stay here and kick back until the famine is over at least. But he didn't do that. He wanted to check on this particular group of people that were probably discouraged. We do know from the context of that passage I just read that they were hungry. He had plenty to eat at the Shunammite woman's place, ample provisions. But these guys were, I think, why does poor and Bible college and student, why are they all put in the same context all the time? They're poor Bible college students. He had to check on them and see how they're. And when he got there, they were sitting before him. It doesn't mean this was story time with Uncle Elisha, It doesn't mean they were playing Monopoly, They were listening to him teach the Word of God. He saw the responsibility to impart his experiences, his knowledge of the Word of God to this younger generation of young men to go out so they can further the work. He had a recent reminder that he wasn't going to live forever. He had just seen his predecessor being caught up into heaven. And I don't think he was really too sure about this role he was going to play in the nation, but he took it, willingly or not. He was doing the job the best he could. But he probably thought to himself, I'm not going to be around here forever. We've got to train the next generation of people that will step in and do the work that God's called us to do. Elisha knew that God had in the past used famines and droughts, difficulties, military conflicts. God uses all of these things to judge a nation. And he knew in his mind that the famine and the dearth and the hunger that the people were experiencing were God's way of bringing the nation back to God. But unfortunately, his students were caught up in that. They were living during that same time in the same region. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, God promises to bless the land and make it fruitful when people obey, but he also promises to bring a curse upon it when they disobey. We learned that Baal was a false god, and he was going to stand up and preach against it. And he begins with this little object lesson. I want to make a few observations about it before I leave this point. When God judges a nation, and if you don't think that God is judging our nation today, you need to get in your Bible a little bit more, or look around a little bit more carefully, or I hesitate to do this. Jim and I were talking Wednesday night. I hesitate to tell you to watch the news more often. If you want to get depressed, that's a good way to do it. But if you don't think God is judging our nation today, you better wake up and realize that there are things that are happening that have been happening for years, and the things that are going to be getting worse for us in the future. And the point is that God does not exempt his people from the difficulties that happen when he judges a nation. You're going to have to just suck it up and realize that problems that will come in our nation, we will share in those problems. We will go through those hardships. But when we approach it from an attitude of faith that, God is doing something to get our nation's attention, we can welcome it. And by the way, God has always sustained his people. But we can welcome that and say, I know this isn't looking good, and I wish our nation were doing better economically or politically or militarily or whatever the case might be. But if this is what God is going to use to bring our nation back to himself, then we're up to that task. You don't see Elisha or his students getting together and have a griping session, What's wrong? Why isn't God giving us food? We're starving here. That's what happens when God judges a nation. And the remnant believers here, we're going to use this opportunity to function as salt and light during a dark time. You will be more effective in dealing with people during times of hardship than in times of blessing. In terms of a lost nation, a lost country, people will be more attentive to you. Isn't it amazing how when there's some big tragedy that takes place, the churches take a spike in attendance? People are coming to churches like, we don't know what's going on here. Something's drastically wrong. We need to find answers for this. Let's go to church. That's a good place to look. You, during times of scarcity or famine or difficulty or spiritual judgment, you will have more opportunities to speak to people about why these things are happening. You do have this, don't you? Say, well, I'm not surprised. The Bible talks about that. It does? Oh, yeah. Let me share what the Bible says about the last days. Let me tell you what God says about a nation that turns its back upon God. We have to function as beacons of hope and light during time. If they see you established in your faith, secure in confidence in the plan of God, and you're not running around like a chicken with his head cut off, then they're going to say, boy, you have something that I don't have. I want to find out how you're enduring all of these difficulties. As it gets worse, our opportunities to share our faith become greater. Again, I don't want hardship for anybody, not the least of which I'm enjoying my life. But if things get difficult for us in whatever context that will take place as a nation, we need to utilize those opportunities to reach out to people and give them the gospel. And we have a tremendous opportunity to give encouragement and instruction to people, and that's exactly what Elisha was doing with these seminary students. He was going there and he's just going to encourage them a little bit and help them out through this process. So we see the scarcity. But I want you to know, secondly, the student. So he gets here on the spot, and these students are sitting around. He probably notices something right away, that they look thinner, leaner than they normally were. He probably says, you're not giving me your full attention. Well, Elisha, we're kind of hungry. We haven't had anything to eat for a while. There's a famine in the land, a dearth of food. And so he says, bring the great pot. We're going to have a big stew. And one of the students there said, well, we can eat this stew out of a cup if we don't get something to put inside. I think I'll just take it upon myself to go out into the wild, and I'm going to find some gourds that we can shred up and put in this pot. At least we have some substance with what we're eating. There's not a lot here. Nobody has any money. There's not a lot we can offer, but I'm going to go out and do my part and collect. And by the way, you have to give him credit for what he was doing. We don't know exactly what he took. The word gourd is a Hebrew word that would be something like a cucumber or a zucchini. I'm a big fan of zucchini. My wife, there's a lot of nutrients and health benefits to zucchini, but the way I like it is she offsets all the health benefits by she puts butter and flour and fries it, and so probably whatever benefits I would have had by eating it raw or lost by. That's how I like my zucchini, and that's probably one of my favorite meals. Her fried zucchini. Oh, she puts Parmesan. I better not talk anymore. You're going to get hungry. But it was something like that. There is, in a commentary I read, there was a plant that grew during Elisha's day that they believe it was called, I give you the Latin name here, Citralis colocynthus. That was the Latin name for this plant. And it was much like a gourd or a zucchini. The only problem with it, it was poisonous. Looked like the good stuff, but it was poisonous. Remember now, the Bible describes this food that he brought. There was wild gourds from these wild plants. And he may well have chosen that particular variety of plant. So the guy brings it back. They shred it all up. They threw it in there to give that stew some substance. And they start eating that, and they get sick, very sick. And they even said there's death in the pot. Some of them were saying, we're going to die. Now, I hope this hasn't happened to you a lot, but sometimes we eat something, we get food poisoning or something that really doesn't settle well with us, and whether we mean it or not, we say, I'm going to die. This is bad. This is not just didn't taste good. There's something very bad with this stew that everybody is enjoying here. And look at verse number 40. It says, so they poured out for the men to eat, and it came to pass as they were eating of the pottage that they cried out and said, O thou man of God, there is death in the pot, and they could not eat thereof. I don't know whether they really were going to die. Sometimes this, by the way, in eating in large enough quantities, that gourd I mentioned to you could kill you. But even if it didn't kill you, it can make you feel like you wish you were going to die. It was a very difficult situation. So Elisha decides to take this opportunity to teach them something about, spiritual things, and spiritual application. The world at that time was full of poisonous ideas. And people had their own way of going about resolving their problems. Unfortunately, to the untrained, non-discriminating mind, this will only lead to misery and death. As we'll see in a minute, God was going to have them do something that made no sense to them at all. Sometimes faith requires doing things that makes no sense to us. We just don't understand it at all. And yet, that's exactly what the prophet of God was going to ask them to do. He was going to ask them to eat some more of it after they made a little alteration in its contents. There's a man, I read a story about a man a couple weeks ago. His name was Ronald Pinkerton. I doubt any of us know the name Ronald Pinkerton. Even if you were a hand gliding enthusiast, you probably wouldn't know about him. But he wrote of an account that he had when he was out one day as a well-trained hand glider. He would go out for hours, reach an altitude of 4,200 feet. That's quite a bit up in the air. And as he was flying around that day, enjoying everything below him, he suddenly found his glider plummeting toward the ground at a very alarming rate. He said he was caught in what he called an airborne riptide, that the wind would just caught his kite, flying kite, and was just driving it down toward the earth and flying down at a very dangerous speed. So he was going down, pretty certain that he was going to die because you don't survive drops from 4,200 feet high. And he happened to look over to the right. He said about 6 feet to the right of him was a red-tailed hawk that was caught up in the same wind gust, the same riptide of air. And that hawk was struggling too. And right next to him, both of them were being sucked down toward the earth. And he looked over and noticed that and said, that bird's going to die just like me. He's falling at such an alarming rate that he said that the trees were coming up, and he described the trees, he said they looked like menacing spikes. That he just sure one of them was going to just tear his body to pieces and he was going to die. And so he started out at 4,200 feet. When he was at about 300 feet, okay, that's about a football field. That's about from the pulpit here to the street. Maybe more than that. Maybe across the street. It's not too far away. Something happened which caught his attention. He said this hawk kind of banged to the side a little bit and then went straight down toward the earth to get out of this tide, this riptide. And as it did that, the warm air from the surface of the earth allowed it to catch its flight, and then that bird rose up to safety. Now he's got this contraption strapped to him, and there's no other alternative. He's just at its mercy, and he thought, I'm going to die. I'm just going to die. There's no way I can survive this. I'm now within a matter of a football field length, looking at the ground, and he saw that hawk do that, and then he said something in his mind said, follow the hawk. Now, that might have been the voice of death speaking to him. I don't know. Follow the hawk. And he said, what have I got to lose? He's traveling at such a high speed. The trees were nearing him. And he turned his glider toward the ground, picked up a little bit of speed, and then, sure enough, when he tried to turn it, the temperature gusts and the change of the warm air from the earth brought his glider up. And he just missed hitting the trees, and he survived the incident, which is obviously why we're reading about his story here. Let me read his own account to you. It's interesting. He said 100 feet, which is really short distance. That's from here to the back door. 100 feet, suddenly the hawk gained altitude, and for a split second, I seemed to be suspended motionless in space. Then a warm surge of air started pushing the glider upward. I was stunned. Nothing I knew as a pilot could explain this phenomenon, but it was true. I was rising. And he survived that incident that day. What will you do when God asks you to do something that's completely in opposite direction of everything logical that you know about your life experiences? Do you have the faith in God to do that? So, I have to get out of this difficult situation, this dilemma, this problem, and I'm trying my best. And what if God says, well, that's not going to work. Why don't you do this instead? Do you have the faith in God to say, I'll do this, even though it doesn't make sense? Because that's exactly what happened here. I want you to see finally the solution in verse 41. And he said, bring meal and cast it into the pot. And he said, pour out for the people that they may eat. And there was no harm in the pot. Here's what he asked them to do to solve their life-threatening stomach problems, their digestive issues. eat more stew. This time we're going to throw some meal in there. We're going to throw some flour, and then when you eat it, you'll be just fine. Folks, that's what we call a miracle. Nothing logical. If you have poisonous food, something that's causing you stomach cramps or you feel like you're going to die, I wouldn't recommend that you go in your kitchen, take some flour and sprinkle it in there and say, okay, now let's eat some more of it. We'll do fine afterward. No, what happened there was nothing short of a miracle. But it was predicated upon the fact that these college students were willing to listen to Elisha and do what he said. And it was contrary to all common reason. Why would the one thing that I should do be the last thing that I would want to do? My wife and I, we had a young lady in our youth group, and she got this bright idea. I think my wife had a speech class, and they were involved in fine arts competition. And these two young ladies, they were sisters. Her last name was Munger. My wife thought it'd be a good idea to take them at the local community college. They had a Edgar Allan Poe recital. One of the students in the college had memorized a bunch of excerpts from Edgar Allan Poe, and he was going to do this as his performance for his graduation requirements. We heard about it, and my wife said, let's take the girls there, these Munger girls, to listen to that, because it kind of gives them an idea of how to do speeches. And great. At that time it wasn't a new car, but it's new to us. It was a 1983 Chevrolet Citation. You probably don't know what those are because they were the world's worst cars. But one day we just went to the grocery store, and we came out of the grocery store, and I said, oh, look over there. You know, there's a commotion. I said, I think that car's on fire, you know. I said, that's our car, honey. And it was it just caught on fire on its own, you know. Terrible car. But it was new to us at that time, and it was our car. We loved our car. Well, these girls came to this thing, and they wolfed down something quick for dinner because it was in the evening. They had chips, tortilla chips, and a melted cheddar cheese. You know, you put it in a crock pot, you know, that cheddar cheese, you know, and they wolfed down a bunch of these chips and cheese. Unfortunately, one of the girls, Sherry, was sick. She got sick, and she's in the back of my car, and her sister said, I don't think Sherry feels too good, you know. And before I could say, well, roll down the window, you know, whatever, she just, indescribable. The aroma of cheese and chips filled the cab of my 1983 Chevrolet Citation. So when my wife went in, of course she felt good after that. When my wife went in with those girls to watch Edgar Allan Poe, I literally spent the next hour and a half making repeated trips back and forth to the bathroom of this community college, getting wet rags and dry rags and wet rags and paper towels. And you know, I never got that smell out of the car. And from that day to this, if you invite me over to your house, and the only thing you have on the menu is tortilla chips and melted cheese, I'll probably eat some of the chips. But my wife will tell you, from that day to this, I've never had creamy cheddar cheese tortilla chips because, just because. Can you imagine the faith of the people that said, all right, and have some more of that stew? You mean the thing that's causing all this? Yeah. In fact, you better have it or you're going to die. You better eat some more of it or you're going to die. What will you do when God asks you to do the one thing that you most dread to do, or the thing you put on the bottom of your list of options to your problems? Can you trust him enough to do it? Father, we thank you.